what about the role of entrepreneurship? I mean, there's always one of the big criticisms of socialism is that it takes away the work incentive. I mean, and certainly the Soviet model, which had a lot of problems. So you've described some of them, was an example of that. I remember visiting Moscow and trying to get a cab, and the cab driver was paid the same whether or not he drove or not. So people basically like, fuck off, I'm not taking you anywhere. And so, that's so if there's a disincentive, is there really, how are people incentivized to work and be innovative and invent new things and come up with new ideas in a socialist economy? I mean, obviously they did in the Soviet Union. How does it work?
Well, first of all, I think it's very clear that in the 1980s, everyone could tell that the Soviet Union needed to transition to be more like China today or Vietnam today. They needed a market sector. They needed to have those cab drivers, get paid based on the people they picked up. They needed those restaurants to be, paid by how many people came in. And you hear stories about, the restaurants giving bad service because the less people who come in, the more food they get to take home and stuff. And that's why I think that the market is an essential part of 21st century socialism. But what the Soviet Union achieved was this was a country that was not electrified. This was a country with no oil industry. This was a country that was completely impoverished, and they had a revolution, and they had 5-year plans, and they built the biggest steel mills in the world. No country was making any more steel than they were. They were electrifying the whole place. They had the biggest hydroelectric power plants in the world. They launched Sputnik into orbit. I mean, they took a country that was in agrarian, unindustrialized poverty, and they made it an industrial superpower with a planned economy by building up these huge state-run industries. And they wiped out illiteracy.
Is that because profits didn't need to be, devolved to shareholders or other people and could be reinvested in the state? Or why was that?
They had a planned economy, and the government sat down and they said, all right, we need to electrify. We need to wipe out illiteracy. We need to industrialize. We need to build a steel industry. And with 5-year central planning, they did it. And that's why Stalin still today is very popular in Russia. People consider Stalin to be a great leader because he took their country up from nothing and he made it an industrial power. Now, after they got over that first hurdle of industrialization, after the roads were paved, after they had modern schools, after they had electrification, that's when the problems that you're describing start to set in. And it was very clear that at that point, you need the market to kind of complement that, industrial base that was built by a state-planned economy. And they needed to transition to be that way, but they had built a system that was very, very rigid, and it couldn't bend and it couldn't adjust. And they tried with perestroika, et cetera, to adjust, but the system they had built was so rigid that they just kind of broke. And it was, we saw the fall of the Soviet Union. After the fall of the Soviet Union, they implemented radical free market policies, and it was a disaster. The 90s was an absolute disaster.
Shock economics.
Shock therapy economics. They were selling off the economy to the highest bidder. It was an absolute disaster. And how did Putin fix it? Well, he fixed it by putting oil and gas under state ownership. And now they use oil and gas revenue to rebuild the industries. And they have very much a planned economy in Russia today, but there's a lot of free enterprise that goes with it. And in fact, a big part of their planned economy is the state subsidizing people to have their own businesses and to bring in foreign investment, et cetera. And that kind of model, that's when you talk about 21st century socialism. It's a planned economy with a market sector, kind of utilizing the market, but having an overall central plan to make sure the wealth of society expands. And that's what most communist governments around the world have today. And that's what I think would ultimately be the solution for America and for most of the world. We should have a rationally organized economy in which people are encouraged to innovate and to start their own businesses, to have new ideas, et cetera. And in our gig economy, that's kind of essential, right? The idea, the old Marxist way of seeing things, it's like the workers in the factory struggling against the factory owner. I mean, that's just not the way modern industry is carried out. We're moving toward a kind of mode of development in which the worker has very little role at the assembly line. But we still need a rationally planned economy so we don't get left behind. Why are self-driving cars a bad thing? If we had a rationally planned economy, self-driving cars would be great. We'd say, hey, this job called driving is no longer necessary. But in our economy, self-driving cars would be a disaster. millions of truck drivers would be out of work. Millions of state highway patrolmen would be out of work. Traffic courts would go out of work. Uber drivers would be out of business. This isn't rational. Why should a great technological leap like self-driving cars lead to poverty? That's what Marx, if you read the Communist Manifesto, you read Capital, you read Critique of the Goethe Program, he's saying this idea that poverty is created by abundance. People not being homeless because there's not enough housing, but being homeless because there's too much housing. People being hungry, not because there's not enough food, but because there's too much food. This is the only system in the world where poverty is created by abundance. Our government spends billions of dollars every year buying cheese from farmers and burying it in a cave in Springfield, Missouri. You can go to Springfield, Missouri, and there's a cave with billions of dollars of cheese in it that just gets buried. Why do they do that? To keep the price of milk and dairy high enough that the farms don't go out of business. That's insanity. Right? That's the irrationality of the capitalist system, overproduction, where we're constantly producing more than we're paying out in wages. People can't afford to buy back what they produce. And the more that we advance technology, the poorer people get. This doesn't make any sense. And we ultimately need a state that will control the economy to make sure that this goes away so that people can innovate and grow. And China is a great example of that. I mean, if you were talking, before I came on about what they're doing with AI, et cetera, they have heavily invested in their population. And they've heavily invested in tech. And they see technological advancement as making the country more prosperous overall, whereas in our system, it's leading to greater poverty, which is simply not rational. We should unleash the productive forces so that technology and human innovation and creativity can advance to even higher levels than we've ever imagined, and we can just continue to build a world of vast abundance.